The rain did not fall on the city, it assaulted it. A cold, relentless siege that had lasted for 6 days now, turning the streets into black mirrors that fractured the neon signs of lesser establishments and swallowed the old gaslight of the Onyx Quarter whole. It was in this quarter, where the architecture grew fangs and the shadows held their breath, that Ilara found herself, a ghost haunting the edges of a kingdom she had no right to enter. Her coat, thin and worn to a sheen at the cuffs, was a useless defense against the water that had seeped into her bones, leaving a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Fear was a colder water, and she had been drowning in it for a year. Tonight, the drowning would end. One way or another. The gates to the sanctum were not wrought iron monstrosities from some forgotten age, but 10-foot slabs of polished obsidian, seamless and silent. They were an ending. A full stop in the city's rambling sentence. There were no guards visible, no obvious defenses, but the air itself seemed to thicken as she approached, humming with a power that vibrated deep in her teeth. Mortals were not welcome here. Their pleas, their bargains, their petty mortal lives were dust motes in the eternal twilight of the being who reigned within. Ilara knew this. Every citizen knew this. You did not trouble the king. But Marcus was coming. She could feel it, a familiar, sickening certainty that crawled up her spine. He had found her new apartment, the one she'd paid for with 3 months of saved tips. A dead bird had been left on her doorstep this morning, its neck snapped clean. A promise. His promise. The police had offered a restraining order, a flimsy paper shield against a man who saw laws as suggestions and her life as his property. So she had come here, to the only power in the city that Marcus, for all his vile arrogance, would be forced to respect. She raised a hand, knuckles white and trembling, and knocked on the unyielding stone. The sound was pathetic, a sparrow tapping on a mountain. Nothing happened. The rain sluiced down her face, plastering strands of brown hair to her cheeks. She knocked again, harder this time, putting the last of her strength into it, the heel of her palm striking the stone with a dull, fleshy thud. Silence. Then, a voice, not from the gate but from the air beside her. He is not taking audiences. Ilara flinched so violently she nearly slipped on the slick pavement. A man stood where only shadow had been a second before. He was tall and severe, dressed in a suit so dark it seemed woven from the night itself. His face was a pale, aristocratic sculpture, and his eyes held the flat, patient disinterest of a predator watching a stream. "Please," she whispered, her voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the storm. "I have to see him. It's life or death." The vampire, for he could be nothing else, let a flicker of something like amusement cross his lips. "It always is. With your kind he made no move to leave, nor to let her in. He was an extension of the gate, just as implacable." "My name is Ilara," she said, forcing the words past the lump of terror in her throat. "I don't have anything to offer. No money, no influence. But I'm begging. Please." The directness of her admission seemed to catch him off guard. He tilted his head, a slow, reptilian movement. "Honesty. A rare currency. And a worthless one. The king has no use for your begging. Then he'll have use for my death," she shot back, a flare of anger momentarily burning through the fear. "Because if you turn me away, I'll die on his doorstep. And a man like Marcus, he won't be quiet about it. He'll make a scene. He'll tell everyone the great King Kalen couldn't be bothered to stop a murder happening right outside his walls. Is that the kind of story he wants spreading through the city?" The vampire's eyes narrowed. The amusement was gone, replaced by a glacial stillness that was far more terrifying. He studied her, from her soaked sneakers to the desperate, wild look in her eyes. He was assessing her threat, she knew. Not the threat she posed to him, but the threat of the complication she represented. A messy, public, mortal death was bad for business. It drew the attention of human authorities and broke the unspoken truce that kept the city from descending into open warfare. For a long moment that stretched into an eternity, the only sounds were the drumming of the rain and the frantic hammering of Ilara's own heart. Finally, the vampire gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Wait," he commanded, and then he was simply gone, the space he occupied dissolving back into rain-slicked night. Ilara waited. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too deeply, lest the fragile thread of possibility snap. The cold was making her shake, violent, uncontrollable tremors that rattled her teeth. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture of comfort. She was so tired. Tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of the hollowed-out feeling in her chest where a life used to be. The obsidian gate slid open without a sound. Not wide, just enough for a single person to slip through. Beyond it lay a courtyard of pale, luminous stone that seemed to drink the rain, leaving its surface dry. The vampire stood there, his expression unchanged. "The king will see you," he said, his tone suggesting it was a profound error in judgment. "Do not waste his time." Ilara stumbled forward, crossing the threshold from the world she knew into something else entirely. As the gate slid shut behind her, the sound of the city, the rain, the distant traffic, the entire frantic pulse of mortal life, was cut off as if by a knife. Here, there was only a vast, echoing silence. She followed the vampire, Waitress he would later be named, across the courtyard and through a set of towering bronze doors that opened into a hall so large it felt more like a cathedral carved from the heart of a mountain. The air was cool and still, scented with old stone, beeswax, and something else, something ancient and metallic, like dried blood and dust. Braziers burned with a clean, blue-white flame that cast no smoke and threw long, dancing shadows up the fluted columns that soared into a vaulted darkness far above. And at the far end of the hall, upon a throne that seemed less carved from stone and more to have grown from it, sat the king. Kalen was utterly still. He was not a monster of nightmare, not a fanged beast. He was a man, dressed in simple, dark clothing that made the pallor of his skin seem almost luminous in the low light. His hair was the color of polished jet, and his face held a kind of ageless, weary beauty. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, silver gray, and they watched her approach with an unnerving lack of effect. It was the gaze of a being who had witnessed empires rise and fall, who had seen mountains turn to dust. What was one small, shivering mortal woman to him? Ilara's steps faltered. The last of her bravado evaporated under that ancient gaze. She was a fool. A drowned rat bringing her pathetic problems to the feet of a god. Her guide stopped a respectful 20 feet from the dais and gave a slight bow. Ilara just stood there, dripping onto the immaculate marble floor, the sound of each drop echoing in the profound silence. "You wished for an audience." Kalen's voice was not loud, but it filled the immense space, a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in her bones. "You have it. Speak." She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight with a knot of fear and unshed tears. She could feel the weight of his attention, a physical pressure. He was not impatient, but his stillness was a command. She took a ragged breath. "My king," she began, the formal title feeling absurd on her tongue. "My name is Ilara. I've come to beg for sanctuary." Kalen's expression did not change, but she felt a subtle shift in his focus, a sharpening. He leaned forward, just an inch, his elbows resting on the arms of his throne. "Sanctuary," he repeated, the word tasting strange in his mouth. "From what?" "From a man," she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength from the sheer, desperate need to be heard. "His name is Marcus. He was with me. And now he won't let me go. He hunts me. He wants to kill me." A faint murmur rippled through the shadows at the edges of the hall, where other figures stood, silent and watchful. The king's court. Waitress, standing beside her, remained impassive. "A mortal dispute," Kalen observed, his tone flat. "Why bring it to my door? Your kind have authorities for such matters." "They can't stop him," she said, shaking her head, the movement frantic. "They gave me a piece of paper. He uses paper to start fires. He is relentless. He is unwell. And he will not stop until I am dead. I have nowhere else to go. No one else to turn to." She looked up, meeting his silver eyes directly, forcing herself not to look away. "They say you are the ultimate authority in this city. That your word is absolute law in this quarter. I am begging you to make my life fall under your law." For the first time, a flicker of something registered in his gaze. It wasn't pity. It was curiosity. The detached interest of a biologist examining a new and unusual specimen. He saw the frayed hem of her jeans, the cheapness of her coat, the way her hands were clenched into fists at her sides to stop their shaking. He smelled the wet wool, the city grime, and beneath it all, the sharp, acidic tang of pure, undiluted terror. It was a scent he knew well, but hers was different. It wasn't the fresh, fleeting fear of a cornered animal. This was old. It was steeped into her, a perfume of dread she'd been wearing for a very long time. "You offer nothing," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "You have no wealth. You have no position. You have no information I might find valuable. You stand in my hall, dripping rain on a floor that has not been touched by it in 500 years, and you ask me to extend my protection, a thing of great value, in exchange for nothing." Each word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall between them. He was testing her. He was dismissing her. "I offer my life," Elara said, the words coming out in a raw whisper. "It's not worth much, I know. But it's all I have. If you protect me, it's yours. To do with as you will. I will serve you. I will clean these floors. Anything. Just, please. Don't let him have me." The final plea broke from her, raw and unguarded. It was the sound of a soul stripped bare. In the silence that followed, a single tear escaped and traced a hot path through the cold rain on her cheek. Kaelan was silent for a long time. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the desperation, but the unyielding core of will that had gotten her this far. She had not crumpled. She had not groveled. She had stated her case with the simple, terrible logic of the doomed. He found it compelling. In the endless, monotonous parade of sycophants and power-seekers who petitioned him, this raw, honest plea for life was a discordant note, and it was a note he had not heard in a very long time. He raised a single, long-fingered hand, and the murmuring in the shadows ceased. "Valerus," he said, his eyes never leaving Elara's. "My king," the severe vampire replied instantly. "This mortal, this Elara. She will be given a room in the east wing. She will be fed. She will be granted sanctuary within these walls for a period of 3 nights." Elara's knees went weak with a relief so profound it was painful. A sob of gratitude caught in her throat. 3 nights. It was a lifetime. However, the king continued, his voice dropping slightly, pulling her back from the precipice of hope. "This is not a gift. It is a period of observation. I will learn the nature of this threat she speaks of. I will learn the nature of her. And at the end of 3 nights, I will render my judgment. Until then, she is my guest. And my prisoner. She will not leave these walls. Is that understood?" He directed the last question to Elara. She could only nod, unable to speak. A guest and a prisoner. She had traded one cage for another, but this one, at least, had walls Marcus could not breach. For now, that was enough. "Take her," Kaelan commanded, and with a final, dismissive glance, he leaned back in his throne, the flicker of interest in his eyes extinguished, replaced once more by the vast, empty stillness of eternity. He had made his decision. Now, he would simply wait and watch. The room Valerus led her to was larger than her entire apartment. The walls were hung with dark, heavy tapestries that swallowed sound, depicting ancient hunts and forgotten constellations. A fire had been laid in the hearth, burning with the same clean, blue-white flame as the braziers in the hall, casting a gentle, wavering light across a bed so large it looked like a snow-covered field. A tray of food sat on a low table: bread, cheese, a sliced apple, and a carafe of water. Simple, but to Elara, who hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, it looked like a feast. "You will remain here," Valerus said from the doorway, his tone clipped and devoid of any warmth. "Another will be by to collect the tray." Do not wonder he didn't wait for a response before pulling the heavy oak door shut, the sound of a bolt sliding home echoing in the quiet room. A prisoner. Elara stood in the center of the opulent space, her wet clothes dripping a small, dark puddle onto the priceless antique rug. The silence pressed in on her. It was a different silence from the throne room. That had been the silence of power, of held breath. This was the silence of a tomb. A beautiful, comfortable, well-appointed tomb. A shudder racked her body, a delayed reaction to the cold and the terror and the overwhelming, crushing relief. Her legs finally gave out and she sank to her knees, burying her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She was too empty for tears. She just knelt there, shaking, as the warmth from the fire slowly began to penetrate the layers of her clothes, a heat that felt alien and undeserved. After a long time, she forced herself to move. She peeled off her wet coat and shoes, leaving them by the hearth to dry. She approached the food tray like a wary animal. The apple was crisp and sweet, the bread dense and still faintly warm. She ate slowly, methodically, forcing herself to chew and swallow. It was fuel. She needed to be strong. She had 3 days. 3 days to convince a being older than the city itself that her small, insignificant life was worth saving. She explored the room, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. There was an adjoining bathroom carved from the same pale marble as the great hall, with a deep tub and soft, thick towels. Luxury like this was something she'd only ever seen in magazines. It felt like a dream, a strange and unsettling one. She ran a bath, the hot water a blessed shock against her chilled skin. As she scrubbed away the grime of the city, she felt like she was washing away the last vestiges of her old life. The Alara who worked double shifts at the diner, who sketched faces on napkins during her break, who dreamed of saving enough money to rent a small art studio, that person was gone. In her place was this creature of fear and desperation, a petitioner in a vampire's keep. Clean and wrapped in a thick robe she found in a wardrobe, she felt marginally more human. The bed was as soft as it looked, the sheets cool and smooth against her skin. But sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus's face. His smile, the one that never reached his eyes. The look of possessive adoration that would curdle into rage at the slightest perceived slight. She remembered the weight of his hand on her arm, holding just a little too tight. The way he would whisper how no one could ever understand her, or protect her, the way he could. She sat up, her heart pounding. The fire had burned low, and the room was filled with deep, menacing shadows. A floorboard creaked in the hall. The whisper of cloth. Was someone there? Was it him? Had he somehow gotten in? Her breath hitched. She was being foolish. The king's sanctum was supposed to be the most secure place in the city. Marcus couldn't get in. But his particular brand of terror had never been about physical walls. It was about psychological infiltration. He had made her own mind a prison long before she'd come to this one. She slid out of bed and padded to the window. It was a tall, arched opening, fitted with thick, leaded glass. It overlooked the central courtyard, now bathed in the ethereal glow of the moon, which had finally broken through the clouds. The rain had stopped. The pale stone drank the moonlight just as it had the rain, and the entire space seemed to be made of solidified light. It was beautiful, in a stark, inhuman way. A figure was standing in the center of the courtyard, looking up. It was Kalen. He wasn't looking at her window, not specifically. His gaze was fixed on the moon. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a solitary figure of black against the luminous white stone. He seemed a part of the profound stillness, as ancient and permanent as the fortress he commanded. This was his observation. She had thought it would be an interrogation, a series of questions. She hadn't realized it would be this, his silent, pervasive presence. He was simply watching the ecosystem he had allowed her to enter, waiting to see how the new element would behave. As if sensing her gaze, he slowly lowered his head, and his silver eyes found her window. He wasn't surprised to see her there. It was as if he'd known she would be. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He simply held her gaze from across the silent courtyard. The distance between them was immense, a chasm of years and power and nature. Yet, in that moment, Ilara felt more seen than she had in her entire life. He wasn't looking at her with pity or contempt or desire. He was just looking, taking her in. And for the first time in so long, she didn't feel the urge to hide. She didn't know how long they stood there, a mortal woman in a borrowed robe and an immortal king in his moonlit courtyard, locked in a silent exchange. But eventually, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, an acknowledgement of her vigil, and then turned and walked away, melting into the shadows of a far colonnade. Ilara finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She returned to the bed, and this time, when she closed her eyes, The image of Marcus's face was replaced by a pair of silver eyes, as cool and distant and beautiful as the moon. And for the first time in a year, she slept without dreaming. The second day began with a soft knock. Not the authoritative rap of Valerus, but something lighter. A young woman with wide, dark eyes and hair in a neat braid entered, carrying another tray, this one with tea and toast. She moved with a silent efficiency that was common to all the sanctum staff Alara had glimpsed. They were human, she realized, but they had a stillness about them that mimicked their master. "The king has granted you leave to walk the library and the west garden," the young woman said, her voice soft and low. "You are not to go anywhere else. I am Lyra. If you require anything, you may ask for me." Alara thanked her, the simple courtesy feeling strange and loud in the quiet room. A library. A garden. It was more than she had expected. She dressed in her own clothes, now dry and warm from the fire. They felt like a costume from another life. The library was a wonder. It was a circular room that rose 3 stories, the walls lined floor to ceiling with books. A spiral staircase of dark, polished wood wound its way up through the heart of the space. The air smelled of leather and aging paper, a scent Alara had always loved. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books. They were in languages she couldn't recognize, their titles stamped in faded gold leaf. These weren't just books, they were artifacts, each one a vessel of history Kaelin had seen unfold. She found a section in a language she could read: English, French, Latin. Poetry, philosophy, histories written by forgotten scholars. She pulled out a thin volume of poetry and settled into a worn leather armchair near a high, arched window that looked out onto the promised garden. For a few hours, she lost herself. She forgot she was a prisoner, forgot Marcus, forgot the ticking clock of her 3-day reprieve. She was just Alara, a girl who loved the quiet company of books. It is rare to see anyone choose that one. Kaelin's voice came from behind her, and this time she did not jump. His presence was so absolute that it announced itself before his voice did. She turned in her chair to see him standing a few feet away, examining a shelf of scrolls. He was dressed as he had been the night before, in simple, dark trousers and a soft tunic. Without the trappings of the throne, he seemed less a king and more a scholar. "The poetry?" she asked, her voice a little unsteady. "The poet," he clarified. "A man I knew, briefly. He felt things too deeply for your world. His heart was a sea in a storm. It drowned him in the end." He ran a finger along a scroll case. He would be pleased to know someone was still reading his words. "They're beautiful," she said, looking down at the book in her lap. "Sad, but beautiful. The most beautiful things often are," he murmured, his gaze distant, as if looking back through centuries. He then turned his full attention to her. "You seem rested." "I slept," she said, surprised to realize it was true. "Deeply. Fear is exhausting," he stated, a simple observation. "It consumes all of a person's resources." He moved closer, his steps making no sound on the ancient wooden floor, and stopped before her chair. He was so tall she had to crane her neck to look at him. "I have been making inquiries into your problem. This man, Marcus." Ilara's brief peace shattered. The fear was back, a cold knot in her stomach. "What did you find?" "He is not simply a spurned lover," Kaelin said, his silver eyes intent on her face, watching for her reaction. "He was, until recently, an acolyte of the Order of Pure Light." Ilara flinched. The Order were fanatics. A militant sect of human purists who believed any trace of the supernatural vampire, which, Fae, was a corruption that needed to be scoured from the earth. They were violent, unpredictable, and utterly without mercy. "They cast him out," Kaelin continued, his voice a low, even cadence. "For being unstable. Imagine. A group of zealots who hunt my kind for sport found him too extreme. He has fixated on you, Ilara. His obsession is rooted in a belief that you are tainted." He let the word hang in the air between them. Tainted. That was Marcus's favorite word for her. He had whispered it to her, screamed it at her. It was the justification for his every cruelty. "My grandmother," she said, the words tasting like ash. "She practiced folk magic. Hedge witchery. Small things. Remedies for colic, charms for finding lost things. She was a kind woman. She hurt no 1 inch. And you? Kaylin asked. Do you practice these small things? She shook her head, clutching the poetry book to her chest like a shield. I have no talent for it. No power. I'm just me. But Marcus doesn't believe that. He found one of her old journals. He's convinced I have some dormant bloodline, some great power he needs to either control or destroy. He calls it a holy mission. He cloaks his possessiveness in the mantle of righteousness, Kaylin summarized, his perception unnervingly acute. A common flaw in mortals. And a dangerous one. She looked at her, and for a moment, the detached observer was gone, replaced by something else, something harder. He believes you are a thing to be owned or a thing to be broken. He does not see you as a person at all. It was the most succinct and accurate description of Marcus she had ever heard. To hear it from this ancient, powerful being was strangely validating. It made her feel less crazy, less alone in her terror. Yes, she whispered. That's it exactly. He held her gaze for another long moment, then gave a curt nod. The garden is pleasant at this hour, he said, the subject changing so abruptly it gave her whiplash. The nightshade is in bloom, and with that, he turned and left her, a silent shadow moving between the towering shelves of books, leaving her alone with her fear and a book of sad, beautiful poetry. That evening, the second night, she ate in her room again. Lyra brought the tray and, with a small, hesitant smile, also brought a vase with a single, perfect, dark purple flower in it. A nightshade. A message. Ilara ate, but her thoughts were racing. Kaylin knew the truth now. He knew Marcus wasn't just a violent ex-boyfriend but a religious fanatic. Would that make him more or less likely to help her? Protecting her from a mortal was one thing, picking a fight with a quasi-religious order of vampire hunters was another entirely. She was an unacceptable risk. He would turn her out in the morning. She was sure of it. The despair was a heavy weight, threatening to drag her back under. She had been given a taste of safety, of peace, and it was about to be snatched away. It was almost crueler than never having had it at all. Later, unable to bear the confines of the room, she found herself drawn back to the window overlooking the courtyard. It was empty tonight. The moon was hidden behind a bank of clouds, and the pale stones seemed to have swallowed all the light, leaving the space dark and foreboding. The brief respite was over. The storm was gathering again. The knock on her door was so soft she almost didn't hear it. It was not Lyra. She knew, somehow, who it was before she opened it. Kaylin stood in the hallway. He was holding a small, lacquered box. "May I come in?" he asked. It was not a command. For the first time, it was a genuine question. She stepped back, holding the door open for him. He entered the room, and his presence seemed to shrink the already large space, filling it with an ancient, coiled energy. He walked over to the small table where her dinner tray had been and set the box down. "The first night, in the hall, I noticed your locket," he said, his back still to her. Ilara's hand flew to her throat, her fingers closing around the small, worn silver oval that hung there. It had been her mother's. It was the only thing she had of hers. "Marcus knows of it," Kaylin continued, turning to face her. "He knows it is important to you." He gestured to the box. "One of my patrols found this pinned to the outer gate less than an hour ago." Her blood ran cold. She walked to the table on unsteady legs and opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a silver locket, identical to her own, except this one was twisted and blackened, as if it had been held in a fire. It was the one her mother had given her sister, years ago. A sister she hadn't spoken to in months, not since Marcus had threatened her for trying to intervene. He had gone to her sister's house. He had taken this. It was a message. "I can get to anyone you love." A choked, strangled sound escaped her. The room tilted. The last of her strength, the last of her hope, crumbled into dust. He would never stop. Even if she died, he would go after her family to punish her for escaping him. Strong, cool fingers gripped her arm, steadying her as her knees buckled. Kaylin's touch was not painful, but it was absolute, an anchor in the spinning chaos of her panic. He guided her to a chair and pushed her gently into it. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice low and firm. She shook her head, gasping for air that wouldn't come. You don't understand. He won't. He'll kill them all just to get to me. He will not touch them, Kaelin said, and the certainty in his voice was so complete, so utterly unwavering, that it cut through her hysteria. I have already dispatched sentinels to watch your sister's home. She is secure. This was a foolish, desperate gesture on his part. An act of a cornered animal. She looked up at him, her vision blurred with tears. His face was unreadable in the dim firelight, a mask of pale, beautiful indifference. But his hand was still on her arm, a steady, grounding weight. This is no longer a personal dispute, he said, his silver eyes glinting. He has challenged me. He has defaced my gate. He has, by his actions, made this a matter of sovereign territory. He has made a grave error. The cold fury in his voice was more terrifying than any shouting rage. It was the fury of a glacier, slow, immense, and unstoppable. He was not angry for her. He was angry that his authority had been questioned. That a gnat had dared to buzz at the lion. She was merely the pretext. But for the first time, Ilara felt a sliver of savage hope. Maybe, just maybe, the king's pride would be a stronger shield than his pity ever could have been. He released her arm and stepped back, his composure restored. Tomorrow is the third night, he said. My judgment will be rendered. Get some rest. He left as silently as he had come, leaving her with the scorched locket and the chilling echo of his rage. Sleep was impossible now. She sat by the fire all night, the blackened piece of silver clutched in her hand, waiting for the dawn that would decide her fate. The throne room was exactly as she remembered it, vast, silent, and cold. The courtiers were assembled in the shadows, their collective, unseen gaze a heavy weight on her shoulders. Kaelin sat on his throne, a figure of absolute stillness. Ilara stood before him, in the same spot where she had stood 3 nights before, a petitioner awaiting her verdict. The past 48 hours felt like a lifetime. She had slept in a soft bed, eaten good food, walked in a beautiful garden, and been more terrified than she had ever been in her life. The 3 nights have passed. Kaelin's voice resonated in the hall. I have observed. I have investigated. I have made my determination. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She braced herself. He was going to turn her away. He would give her some money, perhaps, a carriage to the city limits, and wish her well. A king's hollow gesture. The man Marcus is, as you claimed, a credible and persistent threat, he continued, his tone formal and detached. He is fanatical and resourceful. To shelter you would be to invite conflict. It would be a tedious and inconvenient affair. Her stomach plummeted. This was it. However, he said, and the single word hung in the air, electric with possibility. His actions have constituted a direct insult to this house. Such insults cannot be ignored. Therefore, I cannot simply turn you out to be butchered on my doorstep. It would set a poor precedent. A breath she didn't know she was holding escaped her in a ragged sigh. But your presence here remains a problem, he went on, dashing her nascent hope. A mortal, living under my roof indefinitely? It is a complication. You do not belong here. You have no purpose, no role. You would be a permanent guest. A pet. And I do not keep pets. The courtiers murmured their agreement from the shadows. Valerus, standing near the throne, looked particularly satisfied. Ilara's hands clenched. A pet. The word was a slap. Was that all she could ever be to men with power? A thing to be owned, protected, and kept. First by Marcus, now by him? She lifted her chin. Then let me go, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Thank you for the 3 days of safety. It was more than anyone else has ever given me. I will not be your pet. She turned to leave, her pride a fragile, brittle thing. She would walk out of this fortress with her head held high and meet whatever fate awaited her. I have not dismissed you. His voice cracked through the hall like a whip, freezing her in place. She slowly turned back to face him. His silver eyes were fixed on her, and there was a new light in them, something sharp and intense. I said I do not keep pets, he repeated. I also said you have no role here. But roles can be created. He leaned forward, his gaze pinning her to the spot. "There are ancient laws, older than this city, that bind my kind. Pacts of sanctuary that go beyond mere shelter. A formal declaration of protection, making the subject an asset of the domain, as inviolable as the stones of this fortress themselves. To harm such a person would be to declare war on me and all who owe me allegiance." Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend. An asset of the domain? Inviolable? "Such a pact cannot be given," he said, his voice dropping lower. "It must be accepted. It requires a vow, spoken freely, from the one seeking protection. You would have to swear fealty to me, not as a thrall, but as a resident of this domain. To accept this place as your home, and me as your sovereign." This was the unbelievable moment. The one that would be seared into her memory for all time. He was offering her a choice. He was giving her agency in her own salvation. What would you want from me?" she whispered, the question hanging heavy in the silent hall. "I told you," he said, a flicker of something almost like a smile touching his lips for the first time. "You would need a role. A purpose." He gestured to the towering walls around them. "This fortress is a library of history. We have archives, artwork, tapestries that are fading into dust. They require a delicate hand. A patient eye. I have seen the way you look at books, at art. I have seen the sketches in the margins of a notepad you carry in your purse. You have the soul of a chronicler." He was offering her a job. Not servitude. Not a position as a blood bag or a plaything. A real, respectable position. He was offering her back the part of herself that Marcus had tried to extinguish, the artist. He wasn't just offering to save her life. He was offering to help her live it. "You would be safe," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "And you would have a purpose. Your life would be your own, lived under my protection. That is my offer, Ilara. What is your answer?" Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time, they were not tears of fear or despair. They were tears of overwhelming, impossible gratitude. He had seen her. In the midst of all this power, this ancient, inhuman world, this king had looked at a terrified, broken waitress and had seen not a problem or a pet, but a person. "I accept," she said, and her voice did not tremble. It rang with a clarity and a strength she hadn't felt in years. "I accept." A deep silence fell over the court. The murmuring ceased. Valerus's face was a mask of stunned disbelief. The king had not taken a mortal into his household in centuries, and never like this. Never with a title, a purpose, a choice. Kaelin nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "So be it. Valerus, you will witness the vow." The ceremony was brief and solemn. Ilara knelt before the throne not because she was commanded, but because it felt right. She spoke the words as Kaelin dictated them, her voice echoing in the vast hall. She swore to accept the sanctum as her home, to respect its laws, and to recognize Kaelin as her sovereign protector. When it was done, he rose from his throne, descended the dais, and stopped before her. "Rise, Ilara," he said. "Chronicler of the Onyx Court." She stood, and for the second time, he offered her his hand. Not to steady her, but for her to shake. His grip was cool and firm. A bargain sealed not in blood, but in mutual respect. The matter of Marcus was dealt with that same night. Kaelin did not send an army. He did not dispatch assassins. He went himself. Ilara watched from her window as the king, flanked only by Valerus, walked out of the sanctum's gates and into the mortal world. Marcus was there, of course, lurking in the shadows across the street, a vulture waiting for his prey to be expelled. He was not expecting the king. Ilara could see his shock even from a distance, the way his arrogant posture faltered. There was no fight. There was no grand display of power. Kaelin simply spoke. Ilara couldn't hear the words, but she could see their effect. She saw Marcus shrink back, his face pale with a new kind of fear, one he had likely never felt before. This wasn't the fear of violence or death. It was the fear of absolute, unassailable authority. Kaelin was not threatening him with fangs or claws, he was crushing him with the weight of law, of history, of a power so immense it made Marcus's petty fanaticism seem like a child's tantrum. Kaelin spoke for less than 5 minutes. When he was finished, he turned and walked back into the sanctum without a backward glance. Marcus remained frozen on the sidewalk for a long time. Then, he turned and shuffled away, his shoulders slumped. He looked broken. Defeated not in body, but in spirit. He had been stripped of his holy mission, rendered utterly irrelevant. He would never bother her again. His power over her had been built on the belief that he was an avenging angel and she was a tainted thing. Kaelin had not killed him, he had simply shown him that in the grand scheme of the world, he was nothing. It was a fate far worse than death. Weeks turned into months. The sanctum, once a terrifying prison, slowly became a home. Ilara spent her days in the archives, a vast, dusty chamber connected to the library, filled with scrolls and canvases and tapestries that smelled of time itself. She learned to handle the fragile materials, to mix pigments from ground minerals as it was done centuries ago, to carefully restore the faded colors of a forgotten world. Her hands, once calloused from carrying hot plates and scrubbing counters, grew deft and sure. The charcoal smudges on her fingers felt more honest than any tip money ever had. She saw Kaelin often. He would come to the archives and watch her work, his silent presence no longer unnerving, but comforting. He would ask about the history of a tapestry she was mending, and she would tell him the story depicted in its threads, a story she had pieced together from the library's texts. Sometimes, he would correct her, adding a personal detail, a first-hand account of a battle or a coronation that history had gotten wrong. The Duchess did not have blonde hair, he said one afternoon, looking at her rendering of a courtly scene. It was the color of autumn leaves. And she had a terrible laugh, like a donkey braying. Ilara smiled, a real, easy smile. The texts said she was celebrated for her grace and beauty. The texts were written by a man who was in love with her, Kaelin replied, a ghost of a smile on his own lips. History is rarely objective. Their conversations were like this, small exchanges that bridged the impossible gulf between them. She learned that he was not merely a predator, but a historian, a guardian of memory. And he, in turn, seemed to be reminded of the vibrant, fleeting, beautiful details of the mortal world he had long since detached himself from. He began to see the world through her eyes, through the colors she mixed and the stories she uncovered. One evening, she was working late, trying to capture the exact shade of blue in a faded fresco of the night sky. The work was frustrating, the color elusive. You are trying to match the memory of the color, Kaelin's voice came from the doorway. Not the color itself. She looked up. He walked over to her workbench, which was littered with pots of pigment and sketches. He picked up a small stone bowl of ground lapis lazuli. The artist who painted this saw a sky that no longer exists, he said softly. The air was cleaner then. The stars were brighter. You cannot replicate it. You can only interpret it. He looked at her, his silver eyes holding a new warmth she had never seen before. Show me how you see the sky, Ilara. Not his. And in that moment, she understood. The sanctuary he had offered her wasn't just the stone walls of the fortress. It was this. The freedom to create. The permission to have a vision of her own. He had not just shielded her from her ex. He had given her a canvas and told her to paint her own world. She picked up a clean brush, dipped it in a mixture of cobalt and white, and began to paint. He stayed with her, watching in comfortable silence as a new sky, her sky, was born on the canvas. The fear that had defined her for so long was a distant memory, a faded color from a life she no longer lived. Here, in the quiet heart of the vampire's keep, surrounded by ancient stories, she was finally, impossibly, safe. And she was, for the first time in a very long time, free. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft scratch of her brush on canvas, and the steady, patient presence of a king who had learned to see the stars again through a mortal's eyes. It was the sound of a new beginning.